Okay. By the way, this is a sweetheart pin from the First World War that holds this heart on my hat. I know it looks ridiculous, but it's actually a period reproduction. If you were, oh dear, it's not gonna work. I don't know where the freaking. Okay. Anyway, if you were a girl in Toronto in the First World War, you wore a sweetheart pin if you had a soldier boyfriend serving at the front, and the pin would say what unit he was in. So anyway, um, I don't think I can actually wear this heart while I'm reading. I don't know. I should be able to, but I can't. Okay. Yes, she has. He did not like guns. He did not like guns. Great guns, small arms, that distinction he understood from the encyclopedia that lay, stacked in the upstairs hallway. Not stacked like artillery shells, but flat, each in its own casing, nevertheless. This upright shelving unit had come as part of them, along with a bronzy, clay-made bust of a rather effeminate man which sat on top. John Milton, he had overheard the man say, the drummer who had sold his parents on the idea that these books from A to Z would be good for their somewhat slow son. John Milton, the salesman intoned from the front door, the last man to understand everything. He, the he of the first word of this chapter, did not understand much. War, for example, the war, and was not keen to go. But he was in love, stupidly, with a girl whom he could not have because she did not speak his language, or at least so it was at first. Some language they must have had together, or he could not be in love with her, but she lived downtown, in a part of town, the heart of the city really, called the Ward, where English-speaking boys generally did not go. So what happened was, war was declared, and her two brothers, the one older, the other younger, who also did not speak English, but were learning, everybody was learning to be English in Toronto in those days, they joined up in the very early spring of 1915. After all, the armories were right there, in that odd old neighborhood in which they lived, she and her family of pale, dark strangers. So he joined up too, and almost as if to be stubborn about it, chose the unit the brothers had wound up in, and it was the artillery. A battery of quick-firing 18-pounder guns. Field artillery, horse artillery, the kind of thing people really got excited about in those days. The war was an artilleryman's war, and we now call it, in Canada, the First World War. Some old-fashioned people, such as myself, call it the Great War, or even the Great War for Civilization. She, to him, the girl he was in love with, was civilization. Not because she helped her father sell bananas from his cart on the weekends, but because they were from a place where, he knew, his encyclopedia had told him, civilization, as we know it, had begun, or had been codified, or something. When he looked into her dark, brown, shining eyes, he sometimes thought he could see, exiles wading ashore from Troy, a centurion piercing the side of Christ. Her brothers were suspicious of him. Just how many bananas did one young man need? But he was adamant. It was her or nobody. Add to this that he was absolutely lousy. I mean, it was embarrassing how bad he was at learning other languages, that if and until she learned to speak his own, there was not one solitary word they could utter, this wannabe lover, and that unknown quantity, other. This made her all eyes. For the longest time he had this discipline. Don't look at her dress, her boots, her sleeves, her hair. But since he was buying bananas, she had to place them in his hands, which meant he had, sometimes to touch and always to see those hands. And they were the palmate wonders of the ages to him. Why? It would be very hard for us to know. They were not particularly slim or polished or delicate-looking hands. The delicacy came from her eyes, those days she spared him a smile amongst the many, many other things she had to do, taking and making change, picking up bananas, stuffing them into paper bags, counting coins, bags, fruit. She must have known English numbers at least, at first. Her family had a push cart and a real cart with a horse in front of it. The father drove that. The push cart could be found most days on Elm or Chestnut Streets, or Elizabeth or Agnes, those pallet-rich coveys of sojourner housing that quilted the self-respecting rags and ballad snatches of the ward. It had a yellow and beige striped umbrella made from heavy canvas, and this kept her covered from the sun, the rain, and I was going to say the stars. but they, like civilization itself, were all inside her eyes. Besides, no one needed protection from those, did they? Does anyone out there know what star shells were? Boom shift. Now that is a sound. Boom shift. We will be hearing together in this story a lot. You may think of a typewriter, if you remember what typewriters were and what sorts of sounds they made, but in this story, boom shift, never without an exclamation mark, is going to stand for the sound made when a quick-firing piece of artillery fires. What constitutes a quick-firing piece of artillery, a QF gun? The fact that it fires more frequently than its predecessors, of course, but the root of that lies in the fact that it stays in place when fired. Before the First World War, say during the age of Napoleon, if you fired an artillery piece, the entire gun shot back, slapped by its own blast. However ornate or even quaint it might appear to us, an Age of Napoleon artillery gun was essentially a brute tube made of iron or bronze, and soldiers loaded it from the front end with the gunpowder going in first, some kind of sealing wad second, that could be a hunk of turf torn from the ground, and lastly a cannonball, a solid round thing, generally made of iron. The first cannonballs were rocks. Possibly the old artilleryman's joke about a gun that had a range of 14 miles and threw rocks the rest of the way was a throwback to origins. For artillery is, first and foremost, anything that kills from far, that slays at a distance. David, the David who defeated Goliath with a stone, had an aide named Jonathan, who bore his artillery on his back, in that case David's bow and arrow. His very sling and stone were artillerymen's weapons. But let us return to the age of Napoleon. When fired by lighting a match or wick stuck through a touch hole at the back, the entire apparatus recoiled violently. Oh my goodness, this is boring. And that is another kind of artillery joke. Most of those early guns were called smoothbores, but if you were hit by one of the iron balls that flew, like a blackbird with its spine bent against you, from their spouting mouths, the result would be anything but smooth, nothing at all like a young woman's hands. Cannonballs smash-caded through tightly packed infantrymen, vanishing arms, legs, bellies, and heads in a rage of red spray. Often soldiers could see the balls coming hundreds of meters distant, and if they were well-trained soldiers, they would not, unlike the guns themselves, move. Now, I've said that quick-firing artillery pieces also did not move. The relatively new science of hydraulics meant that the tube of the gun rode back in place on a kind of cradle, strange term for one of these babies, and a piston system both absorbed the shock of it and returned that babe, also called a barrel, to its original position, so the gun stayed in place and, being loaded through the breech with an all-in-one shell casing explosive combo, it could be fired very fast. Speaking of babies, this back-and-forth piston business is not intercourse. Take my word for it, this is not even vaguely like sex. What it is like is hard to say, but in this book, each time you hear or read, each time you read or hear a boom shift, complete with exclamation mark, it will mean that we have changed time and place in the story. For example, boom shift. Yes, we have no bananas, she said triumphantly as she handed him a bright yellow bunch with one hand and he handed her a 5-cent coin with the other. What she had just sang out that afternoon became part of a song, and lots of people eventually knew it. Yes, we have no bananas today. Those were the first English words he ever heard her say. The problem was, that song was not written or published until 1922, and this was 1915. But she didn't care. She was smiling so hard at him she could hardly keep her teeth behind her lips. He almost dropped the coin. No, he did drop it, then quickly snatched it up from the dust of the sidewalkless street, wiped it clean, and handed it to her again. Once she had taken it, she took the back of his right hand with her left, and gave him 4 pennies in return, and with each large coin, for pennies were large in those days, bending one of his fingers forward over them, with each word said, "We have no bananas." And then wrapping his thumb shut around his fingers with her bare right palm, she held his fisty hand in her 2 hands for a heartbeat, or forever. Yes, his fingers were a smaller version of the bunch of bananas he held in a bag in his left hand by his side. When she withdrew both her hands, the bright fall air commenced kissing the sweat on his right hand skin. He was so far into her eyes at this point. Sorry, into people in 1915. He was so far into her eyes at this point, it could have been night for all he could tell, but she said merely, day. So maybe she didn't write that idiotic song, or even know about it then, or at any other time. He certainly did not know what a traveler she would become. All he knew was she had held his right hand emphatically in both of hers, and that this event constituted, for now, the wildest ride of his life. Day, daytime, that meant present, not a fairy tale. She was in history now, and good and bad or good things could happen with that. He became conscious for the first time of her breathing. She actually breathed. Letting his stare slip from hers, he saw she had a pulse. There were veins ferrying blue blood up and down her neck like Jacob's ladder. The wind blew in her hair, which seemed very heavy and black, and was partly held in place by something, not a banana. But by the time he found her eyes again, they were full and glassy with tears. One fell. "Brothers," she said. "My brothers," she said, and then, as if digging a rotten potato out of the earth with her throat, added, "Guns." And that is the how of why he joined up. He joined to watch over them, her brothers, and he hated guns because they had made her cry. This boy, this young man, may have been somewhat slow, but he was a quick study at devotion, as so often they are. Boom. Shift.